Welcome to the 4 Basic Ingredients for Teaching Writing webinar. I'm Kelsey Jenkins with McGraw-Hill Education, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being presented in listen-only mode, which means you'll be able to hear the presenter, but they won't be able to hear you. However, that doesn't mean you can't participate. We, of course, want to hear any questions you have, so just type them in the questions panel on your toolbar. Joining us today is Steve Graham. Steve is the Warner Professor in the Division of Leadership and Innovation in Teachers College. For over 30 years, he has studied how writing develops, how to teach it effectively, and how writing can be used to support reading and learning. He is an advisor to a variety of organizations, an editor of the Journal of Educational Psychology, and the co-author of several books, including Making the Writing Process Work. We are excited to have Steve here today, and thank you, Steve, and welcome.
Hi, and welcome to everybody, and thank you for attending. What I'd like to do is first start by thinking about some of the challenges that developing writers or young children face as they start on the path to becoming more skilled writers. One of the issues is that students come with a lot of knowledge to school, but there's a lot that still is left to learn. And the knowledge that they do bring, either about different kinds of genres, how to think about, plan, evaluate, and monitor what they're doing when they're writing, their sentence construction skills, their transcription skills involving handwriting and spelling are not fully developed. And that presents a challenge just because students have to do, or young children have to engage in a lot of different activities to write, and all of those things take a lot of cognitive resources. Another issue in terms of thinking about young children in writing is that the strategic skills that they bring to writing early on are pretty primitive in the sense of they do very little planning in advance. They don't evaluate much of what they write except in terms of whether it fits the kind of topic that they're looking at. Revision is pretty sporadic when it occurs and often is not very successful. And so one of the things that we want to be sure is that students learn how to become more skillful, more thoughtful in terms of planning, revising, editing, monitoring, evaluating, and those kinds of things. Now, the good news is that most young children come ready to write. They're motivated. They like writing just like they like reading. The challenge for us often is to keep kids motivated as they move through the curriculum. The tendency is for kids to kind of stay flat in terms of their motivation around writing, or for it to even decline as they move into the upper elementary grades. And then finally, something that I alluded to a few minutes ago is that there are some fundamental writing skills that are important for children to master early on. And if they don't, they tend to interfere with other thinking processes. And I think the easiest way to demonstrate this is just think about yourself. There's been times where your hand, whether it's keyboarding or writing with pencil or paper, is not fast enough to keep up with your mind. Ideas are coming really quickly. You don't get it down fast enough, and you lose something. This is particularly problematic, these kinds of issues, for very young writers. Most kids in first grade write about 20 letters per minute. If you want to get a sense of this, of what the challenges that they face, write with your non-dominant hand and spell every fourth word backwards, and you'll see how frustrating it is. And this makes for a challenge for young writers in terms of applying their knowledge, their strategic skills, and if they don't develop a strong foundation in fundamental writing skills, there's often something to pay in terms of motivation later on. So one of the things that I'd like to share with you today is, from an evidence-based viewpoint, what do we know about making sure that kids develop the knowledge, the strategic prowess, the will, and the skill that they need to become more effective writers, to get them on that road as young developing writers. And there's really, I think, 4 basic things that we can say. Kids have to write. We need to teach them. We need to support them as they write. And we want to connect writing and reading. I'm not going to talk about it today, but we also want to connect writing as a tool for learning. In terms of thinking about writing, one of the ways of thinking about how powerful this is for very young children is that if we increase students' writing by about 45 minutes a week, 40 or 45 minutes, kids who are performing at the 50th percentile, our typical kids, jump about 12 percentile points in terms of the overall quality of their writing. Now, that's actually a great message, because there's another part of this that I want to share with you as well, and that is when we increase how much students write, there's also for young children a corresponding jump in their ability to comprehend text. You know, basically about a 10 percentile jump on norm reference standardized tests. So when we ask kids to write more that are young developing writers, not only does their writing get better, but their reading gets better as well. You always like to get a twofer like that. Also, in terms of thinking about having students write, you know, it's not just having them write, but it's making sure that when we have them write, we engage them in processes that will increase their chances of being successful, their motivation for writing, and their development as writers. And so one of the really nice things that the process approach to writing instruction does is it provides extended opportunities for kids to write. And so in contrast to sometimes what we see in more skill-oriented writing instruction, not always, but sometimes, where there's very short writing tasks and students are done in 10 or 15 minutes, we see children having the opportunity to return to the things that they're working on for multiple days. Also, there's an emphasis on writing for real purposes and real audiences. Now, I recognize that this presents a challenge because often we're finding ourselves having to create those situations. But at a very simple end, if children write for each other and not just for the teacher, it creates a real audience. And the more that we can take that writing into the real world, where we develop something that has an audience that is meant to be influenced in some way, for example, writing an advertisement, holding a rally where you're going to save a stream, and you write placards or write letters that you put in neighboring mailboxes. Anything that has a real purpose increases kids' interest in it and motivation for writing. Another important thing for very young early writers is we want them to get into the process of thinking about what they're going to write in advance of writing, taking an initial plan, modifying it and changing it as they write, but translating that into written text, and then evaluating and reviewing it. For very young children, their basic approach to writing typically is one that I think of as the Vulcan mind dump. So we ask them to write about a particular topic, and let's say we ask them to write a story about a cow, something that I probably wouldn't recommend as a writing assignment, but to illustrate this, it serves well. So they'll think about, oh, you know, stories begin once upon a time. And they'll think, you know, I know Betsy the cow. So once upon a time, Betsy the cow was in the field. She was having a very nice day. It was very sunny. And so what we end up with is something where they just drop ideas out of their mind as they go, with the last idea serving as the stimulus for the next idea. Now, there's a very good reason why very young children engage in that kind of Vulcan mind dump or knowledge-telling approach, and that is a lot of the other activities that are involved in writing, thinking things, involve a lot of cognitive resources. And for very young children, the act of transcribing and taking ideas and putting them in sentences also require a lot of cognitive resources. So in fact, if you think about the head as a fishbowl, there's more resources than the fishbowl holds, and so what you can actually take out of the translation is you can reduce the amount of planning, evaluation, monitoring, and revising that goes on, because at the end of the day, you have to get something on paper. And so we want to make sure that young children, even if they're not fully successful at a young age, plan, translate, evaluate, and review. Another thing in terms of thinking about the process approach to writing that I think is very valuable is the idea that students take personal responsibility and ownership of what they write. And the way that this plays out in this particular environment is that when we conference with students about their writing, we ask them questions, we may have subtle hints about things that they might think about doing, but ultimately we're encouraging them to make decisions and for the composition to be theirs. We're not taking it over. And the other thing that I really like about this, it's creating a supportive writing environment where kids can take risk and there's positive support for sharing what they create with others. Now the nice thing is when we put those kinds of things into place, we get about a 16 percentile jump from the 50th percentile for young writers. So it's very powerful. A second important aspect, remember I said write, teach, support, and connect. A second important aspect is to teach. And so the issue is what to teach. What are you going to get your biggest bang for your buck, so to speak? And one of the things that is very powerful for children starting in first grade and moving all the way through high school is to explicitly and systematically teach them strategies for planning, revising, drafting, and editing text. And basically, the idea behind this is that students are taught strategies that they can use independently, that they can do it on their own. And there's a lot of different kinds of strategies that can be taught. They range from very simple ones that you might teach a first grade child like brainstorming, which can be applied quite broadly, to strategies that are designed for specific types of writing such as stories or persuasive essays. As an example of this, we might have a student generate on a persuasive essay for an older writer as many ideas as they can think on each side of a topic, then encourage them to make a choice about which side they want to take, decide which ideas are going to be their strongest points for supporting their viewpoint, which ones they most need to reject, and do some initial thinking about how they're going to order those in terms of their composition so that they have a basic plan to proceed with. Now, when we teach strategies like this, we describe them, we model them, we give students support until they can do it independently. You get a huge jump, 35 percentile jump. It's even larger with struggling writers. A second thing that's very important for very young children in the first 3 grades is explicitly teaching them handwriting and spelling. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about spending your whole writing program doing this. We don't need to do that. We can spend short periods of time, 3-4 times a week, and we can have a pretty strong jump in the overall quality of writing as a result of helping students become fluent handwriters or keyboarders and more accurate or fluent spellers. In addition, there's some other benefits when we do this. Handwriting legibility gets better, handwriting fluency gets better, spelling accuracy gets better, but there's also, from the spelling end, an improvement in word reading skills, word reading skills, reading fluency, and also reading comprehension. And so in this case, you get kind of a twofer again. You do something in writing, there's a corresponding positive effect in reading. Now, in terms of talking about teaching handwriting and spelling, we're talking about, again, short sessions with handwriting. We're modeling how to form the letter. Students get short periods of practice on doing that. Not a lot, 6 or 7 practices with an individual letter at a single time. And we're looking for some activities to increase in fluency. And with spelling, we're wanting to make sure that students know the most common words that they're likely to use in their spelling, and that's a relatively small set, somewhere between 1,000 to 3,000 words, but we also want them to understand the aspects of English orthography that are consistent, and using word sorting and other techniques helps to do that. In addition, for young children, we want to teach them to become more skillful at constructing sentences. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is a technique called sentence combining. You'll notice you get a good jump in terms of overall quality of text, again, 19 percentile points, plus sentences become more complex and more correct, With sentence combining, what we typically do is we take two smaller sentences and we model as a teacher how to form them into a more complex one. So the dog is big, the dog is black, and we model how to form that into the dog is big and black, or the black dog is big. And what we do is we play with those sentences with our students, having them practice with us, and having them then go to their compositions and using the skill that they just learned to make revisions or to create new text. Also, we want to help students acquire through teaching the basic knowledge about the types of writing that we want them to engage in. And when we do that, we get, again, a large percentile jump in terms of overall writing quality. And this is pretty straightforward. Reading is the springboard for this. We might be reading stories, looking for the types of things that the author does in terms of presenting the story and structuring it, or how they use words, or how they create suspense with the use of particular devices. And then what we do is we help students bring that to their own writing or to emulate it in their own writing. So we've covered two of the four, write and teach. In addition to writing and teaching, we want to support students as they write. And there's a number of evidence-based ways that we can do that. One of those is having peers work together as they compose, and this could be involved around planning, drafting, revising, editing, publishing, etc. It could involve one or all of those things. When we bring peers together to do those kinds of strategic things, we get a 31 percentile jump in their performance. Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying you just shuffle kids together and say, hey, you guys plan and you guys write. What we want to do is we want to show them how to engage in those processes. So if they're not sure about how to do that, or if they're not willing to share as they plan, then it's not going to have these kind of results. All the studies looking at this involve preparation in advance to make this successful. Another thing, and probably as a bang for its buck, you get more for this than anything else that I can think about, and that is for the teacher to set clear writing goals. This doesn't take a lot of time, and you get a 28 percentile point jump in terms of overall quality. So when I teach a college class, for example, and I have a paper assigned, you can bet that students are going to ask me some questions about the assignment, because all writing tasks or assignments are in effect ill-defined problems. So they're going to ask me, how long does it need to be? How many references do I need to have? Now that's strategic on their part, because they're trying to make me do a means-ends analysis of the product. So they want to know what's expected. And guess what? When we tell kids what we want, we're more likely to get it, whether they're younger kids or older kids. So let me give a couple of simple examples to this. Many very young kids, when they revise their text, they do what I call a thesaurus approach to writing. They try to clean up a spelling error here and there. They try to correct punctuation. They change out a word here or there. They have a little bit of a phrase. But there's not really much change in the overall composition itself, other than trying to, treat it like a window cleaning. And so one kind of goal that I might set for kids is a fairly simple one. Add 3 new ideas to the composition as you revise it. Or if it's a story, I might give a goal to add a new character or to set it in a different time. Now I have to be really frank. Sometimes kids will beat you at this game. In one of the we had these goals changes in the moral story, and we had 2 kids at the end of the story who picked a goal to add a character, and the only change they made was when they got to the end of the story, they added a sentence, oh, by the way, Johnson was in the story too. So while goals can direct attention, without a little support from you, they may not always get what you want. Another fairly simple supporting activity that provides a strong jump in terms of the overall quality of young students' writing is engaging kids in pre-writing activities. And these range all the way from gaining information about what to write through reading, and that can involve both books, magazines, or internet material if that's appropriate for students, but it also can involve generating the ideas that you know and organizing them on a graphic organizer. And so in studies that have taken a look at this, what usually happens is the teacher will do a first graphic organizer with students so they know how to do it, and then they're on their own. But if you think about how much time that takes, it's a pretty simple approach for helping students get ideas out and get them organized. Now, of course, just as with any kind of writing, you don't want that to completely dominate the situation because you want them to continue to plan as they write. And so that's the challenge with pre-writing activities, is you're going to want to think of ways of engaging them to go beyond what they generate in a graphic organizer or some other form that they use as a pre-writing activity. Another important support that we can provide to students as they write is assessment. Now, I'm going to share two types of assessment with you. But I'm going to mention another one to you that is on the horizon. I think it'll be a while before we see this used much with younger kids, but we will be seeing it more with upper elementary grade kids and kids in middle school and beyond, and that is feedback from automated essay scoring programs. Those are increasingly getting better, and they'll continue to get better, and the limited amount of work that has been done so far suggests that you get about a 10 to 15 percentile jump in terms of writing quality as a result of getting feedback like that. And the nice thing about the feedback that you get from automated essay scoring is you get it immediately. Now, the downside is it's not really reading your composition, it's looking at a set of syntactic and semantic, grammar and vocabulary indices that are related to the types of evaluations that they give. But increasingly, we're going to be able to see these kinds of machines highlight text and say, take a look at this. This might not be clear to the reader. So I just want to mention that because that's on the horizon. Now, in terms of feedback in general, when we provide students, whether it's ourselves as teachers or whether it's peers who we've taught how to do this, when students get feedback about their writing, there's about a 29 percentile jump point in the overall quality of what they do. Now, if we're working with peers on this, we need to teach them how to do that, and we find that it's effective to be very specific about the type of feedback that they give. So, for example, with a third grade child, what we might ask them to do is go through a peer's paper and put a question mark by each place that's unclear to them, and a caret by places where they think more information should be given, and then we work on how to provide feedback from peer to peer so it's more like a conversation about what has been written. So if it's a story about a vacation in the winter to go skiing, one of the students might say, this is really great, I love to ski, but I didn't quite understand how you got there. Can you tell me a little bit more about the trip there? Or this part about where you fell was unclear. I'm not sure what made you fall. And so when we give feedback, we're pretty good at it, but we want to make sure that students are good at it too. We can also teach students to self-assess their own writing. And when we do that, we get about an 18 percentile jump. But again, this is a teaching thing. We have to be very clear on the criteria that they use. They need to understand them. And we need to give them practice in terms of doing that, which includes modeling where we do this together with them, and then them doing it with other kids with our assistance and help until they feel comfortable doing it alone. Now, another form of support, which would be nice to see in more classrooms, involves having students use 21st century tools like word processing and related software to write. We do a number of national surveys with teachers from 1st to 12th grade. In the first 3 grades, the only thing that happens less often than using word processing in the classroom is talking to parents about kids writing. Even at the high school level, only about 50% of compositions are typed, and most of that work is done at home. And there's obvious advantages to word processing. You can move text easily, you can delete it, you can add. It's really easy to make changes. That's a very nice feature. Plus, it comes bundled with other things like spell checkers. So when kids use word processing over time versus writing by hand, there's an 18 percentile jump. And one of the really nice things is that you can almost triple that with some of the workbenches that are being developed today that have other forms of help built into them, like software for planning that, is basically a graphic organizer for getting your ideas out and organizing them. Vocabulary assistance as you go, where it's easy to click on a word and get a number of other words. But there's a number of these kind of things that can be also built into word processing, and they really increase its power. And I expect that we'll see more and more of those as word processing makes its way into the classroom. Now, this brings me to the final thing I'd like to talk about, and that is connect. So we need to have kids write, we need to teach, we need to support, but we want to connect to reading as well. And so here's the great thing. When we use writing to support understanding what students read, there's an 18 percentile jump in their reading comprehension. So let me give some examples of this. If we pose questions about what a student read and have them write their answers out, it's not quite an 18 percentile jump, but there is an improvement in reading comprehension when we ask them to write a summary of what they've read. And this is particularly effective when we teach them how to do so. Reading comprehension improves. When students are taught how to take notes about what they read, reading comprehension improves. And when we ask them to analyze what they read in more substantial ways, for example, to relate it to their personal lives, to use what they've learned from their reading, to describe how they might use it in a new context, to take a point of view in what was read and write a persuasive text or an opinion text that supports that or another point of view is also very powerful. The other part that I'd like to point out about this is that I've alluded to this already, but when we teach writing, there's a corresponding improvement on reading, and when we teach reading, there's a corresponding improvement on writing. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong idea here. What's typically happened in the past is we focused our attentions on reading and we've ignored writing to a large degree, and I think part of that has been on the assumption that you're a good writer, you'll be a good reader. It's just the opposite. If you're a good writer, you're virtually always a good reader, but being a good reader is no guarantee of being a good writer. And so we need to devote specific time to teaching both reading and writing. Now, in conclusion, I want to make a point that I believe strongly in, that good writing is not a gift. It is forged by desire, practice, and assistance from others. And some of the most important assistance that students get in terms of developing as writers is by teachers. All of us, I suspect, that are participating in this webinar today can remember one really great writing teacher that we had. It's even better if you can remember 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, or 12. And then finally, I think there's this viewpoint that writers are born and not made. Now, I'm not going to argue against talent in writing, because you see some really phenomenal writers, and it does feel like a gift. But for 99% of us, we're made. We can learn to be a good writer. We can learn to be skilled at this. Whether you're a typically developing kid or you're a kid who might have special needs, there's plenty of evidence that we can make a difference for all kids in becoming better writers. And the really nice thing about this, you become a better writer, you become a better reader, and as you become a better writer, you have a tool for helping you think deeply about what you're learning, and you become a better learner. Thank you guys very much.
Great, thanks, Steve. We have a couple questions here, and I just want to encourage any of the other attendees, if you have questions, please type them in the questions box on your toolbar, and we'll get some answers for you. One of our attendees would like you to kind of expand upon the translating cycle that you mentioned in the earlier part of your presentation.
Sure. So I'm going to actually approach it from two ways on translation. There's basically, if you think about the process of writing in a very, very simple way, this is about as simple as I can make it. You have an image in your head. You know, I'm actually looking out as we're doing this. I live next to a mountain in Arizona, and I can see saguaro cactus on the mountain. So I might have an image of a saguaro cactus. And so if I want to write about that, I have to turn that idea into an acceptable sentence. And so I'll probably be rehearsing this or sub-vocalizing it in my head. Little kids may be actually vocalizing it as they do it, but I'm probably generating this sentence in part, and this is facilitated by the great amount of knowledge about speaking that young children and also myself and you too bring to the task about how language is put together. But I've got to do this in a way that, you know, gets at the intention. I want to make saguaros seem beautiful to you, and I want to make it clear, and I want it to be semantically correct. Now, we haven't touched translation at this point, but we then have to put that on the paper, so to speak, whether it's paper as we traditionally know it or whether it's digital text or in some other form, which actually could be speech-to-text synthesis. But in doing that, the typical kinds of skills that we apply, they're not exclusively limited to this, are either handwriting and keyboarding and spelling. Of course, you know, if you think about texting, you might be using your thumbs, but you got the basic idea. So one of the issues in terms of thinking about that translation, translating that into, or transcribing that into text, is that until we become relatively automatic at doing these skills, there is a price to pay. And it's not just automatic, it's automatic and correct. So there's a price on the reader. And so the easiest way to demonstrate this is that if I take a composition that's written, you know, I asked 100 kids in 6th grade to write something, and I rank order those from the best to not the best in terms of quality of ideas in them, and pull out the one right in the middle, number 50, 50th percentile. And I take that and I add 5 spelling errors to it, or make no spelling errors there, or I create a draft that is really legible, or a draft that's not illegible but hard to read. And then I ask people to evaluate that material based upon the quality of the ideas, not on handwriting, not on spelling. What you find is that handwriting legibility has a huge effect. It can drop the evaluation of the quality of the ideas by almost 30 percentile points. Spelling, those 5 spelling miscues, can drop it by 15 percentile points. We haven't changed the word. All we've done is change the way it looks, in a sense, the difficulty in terms of reading it, and the number of spelling miscues is very similar in terms of spelling. So if you misspell words, if your handwriting is sloppy and difficult to read, if you have a lot of grammar errors, there's a price to be paid with the reader. And for young children, the price is paid as teachers evaluate their compositions. Even when we ask people to ignore these things, it's very difficult for them to do. The other price is paid by the writer, so it's a writer effect. And so as an example, many kids who struggle with writing in 4th grade can misspell as many as 1 out of every 4 or 5 words. So think about that. You're trying to hold this idea in working memory, you're trying to craft it in the right sentence, and you don't get the whole sentence in your head because it's too long, so you're doing it in parts and trying to write it down, and you have to stop and spell a word. And you have to think about that. Well, as soon as you have to do that, stuff starts flittering out of your mind. You might lose the idea that you're trying to hold there. And if you're doing this every fourth or fifth word, it's very interfering. So we often find that kids who have spelling difficulties, they produce much less text and it's less organized. So it's kind of a different way of looking at it versus the one where I said your hand is not fast enough or your keyboarding is not fast enough to keep up with the ideas, where you lose ideas because they slip away as you're writing because you can't hold them all in working memory. And working memory, unless you're rehearsing stuff, has a very short span of life, so to speak. Things come in and out of it very easily. So it's a reader and a writer effect, and we want to make both of those go away. It takes longer for the reader effect to go away, but the writer effect, we can get kids pretty fluent in handwriting and spelling by the end of third grade and pretty good spellers by the end of third grade. We want to make that happen.
Great, thanks, Steve. Another one of our questions comes from Jessica and says, what are some of the best ways to improve spelling in the third grade?
Hi, Jessica. So I want to start by saying the only people who really like spelling are really good spellers. So I think one of the things in terms of thinking about spelling is what do we need to teach? And I would also encourage us to think, how can we make learning to spell more enjoyable? And so I mentioned earlier that a small number of words account for a large percentage of the words that kids are going to use, actually all the way through 12th grade, but particularly in 6th grade. So if you learn 800 spelling words, that's about 80% of the words that most children use in the 1st to 6th grade. You move up to 1,000, you get to about 90%. By the time you're 3,000, you're bordering on about 99%. So you see a point of diminishing returns in this. So you could just simply have students, kind of memorize the spelling of those words, and that's often been done. It's not the approach that I would suggest. What I would suggest instead is that we group words that fall into those very common words around these that exist within the English language. So, for example, think about very consistent rules applied a lot, and you have short words like hop goes to hopping, and hope goes to hoping, and you can visualize those letters in your mind. Those are pretty consistent rules, and so if I was to introduce words for spelling on a particular week, I would have 2 or 3 patterns that I'm helping students understand that consistency in English orthography. At the same time, they're learning specific words around that. So my starting point would be with a word sort where I have hopping and hoping as key words, and we have words like that that fit both, that we sort and think about what's the rules underlying this. And once students are able to do this, now I may need to help them a little bit, I'm going to have some words that might not fit that, and so that they see that these rules don't always apply. Now, I'll also encourage them to do some study of these common words, but that would be in a game format and likely peers doing it together, because that's a lot more fun than just sitting down and trying to rote memorize. And I would have some word building activities. So let's say hope and hopping. I might take OPE, take the rhyme and OP, and have students work together to build as many words as they could. And I would also have kids going out into their reading at home, into their other writing, and then look for as many words as they can find. And we would build that week a tree in our classroom with words that fit those patterns to make the tree. Now, it might be something the next week, but I would be as reinforcing as I could to students for bringing those kinds of words in, because it increases the power of what you're doing. So those would be some suggestions that I would have in terms of thinking about third grade. And we've done this with kids, both who find spelling challenging and those who don't at those grades, and it's been very successful.
Great, and I have a message from Jessica saying that was excellent, and thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
And then Casey would like to know some strategies or best practices to guide students to write more independently. or some things you would like to highlight there?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question, and you know, this is more. Well, I shouldn't say it's more of an issue. It's particularly an issue with very, very young kids because as they're coming in to writing from home or from preschool, we want them engaged in writing, and often that will involve creating pictures, sometimes words and letters to go with it, sometimes just letters, maybe scribbles. But we want that to happen, and we want to encourage that. But another tool within our toolbox that as we move into kindergarten and first grade is interactive writing. And in interactive writing, the teacher and the students compose together. So the teacher in essence takes the role of the scribe, but it's different than dictation, which is also another tool in our toolbox, where in this case there's going to be dialogue around the interactive processes of writing. I might put something up and leave a period out, and I might say, oh, remember what does a sentence end with? And so students have to use and display, in a sense, display is not the right word, but they have to use their knowledge there. Or if nobody knows, it's a point for me to kind of point out. The sentence above, I have a marker to show that this is where that idea ends. And so I think interactive writing, it hasn't been investigated as much, but when it has, either in preschool, kindergarten, and early first grade, it has had positive effects. Now, a different way of answering your question would be is to think about kind of the strategy instructional stuff that I mentioned earlier. And so I'm going to share with you a fairly simple strategy that we've used all the way down to first grade, and it revolves around story writing. What we do is we initially start by reading stories that other people, often kids, if we can find good stories that kids have made, that have particular parts in them. So almost all stories in kind of traditional Western lingo will have a setting which usually occurs, whoever your protagonist is or your character or characters are, a setting and a time. Now, time might be ambiguous, setting might be ambiguous, but there's always characters. And then there are episodes, and I don't use setting and episodes as words with kids that are that young, but basically there's something that starts the story off. There's a starting event, and then the characters have goals that they're trying to achieve, and actions occur, and things get wrapped up, either successfully or unsuccessfully, and along the way, people feel good, they feel bad, they're elated, they're happy, etc. And so we look at those things in students' stories, and we identify those. And once we feel that kids can identify those, then we take an idea together and have them generate ideas for each of those elements that they might use in the story. And then we turn to developing a story ourselves with the teacher taking the lead. And so the teacher will plan out something, and they'll basically use this kind of thing. We'll put it in a who, when, where, what's the main character want to do, what happens, how does it end, how do people feel, how do the characters feel. And so we'll generate ideas, not so much the teacher, although they might get the thing started, but have kids generate ideas for that story. And then what we do is we decide which ideas we want to use, and we interactively compose a story together, and we make some changes as we go. So that's the first step in terms of release of control, because students are playing an active part in that. And we may decide to do that more than once, but then the next step is to have peers work together with the teacher circulating and providing assistance as needed, and then moving to independent practice. Now, often we'll have like a graphic organizer for kids to get their ideas down, but at the end point we move that graphic organizer and all those other supports out of the way. And so it's truly a scaffolded approach, moving from teachers carrying a good bit of the load to encouraging students to do that as well. Now, if you ask on that strategy, how long does it take to do that? We usually confine on that strategy that I was talking about, that story grammar one, about 6 sessions or 7. Even with kids with special needs, can be doing this independently. And I'm not saying that's all you would want to do, because we'll often have for different kids different goals that they might work on in their own writing. So we may have some kids who have a goal to include as many $1 million words as possible. But another way of thinking about independence is we provide the springboard from which it develops.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and this comes from Stephanie, and it's kind of long, so I'm just going to read it.
Well,
and then
my responses are kind of long, so.
Yeah, it works out great. So some of our first graders write their complete thoughts on their graphic organizers and then recopy their ideas on their first drafts with no changes.
Yeah.
But we've been modeling during shared interactive and teacher read-alouds, or write-alouds, sorry, how graphic organizers are a place to record their ideas and they don't speak complete sentences. Then we model those ideas to form complete sentences when drafting. So other than continued modeling, do you have any suggestions for helping students see graphic organizers as a place for ideas, or do you think it's okay for them to write their complete sentence, full-out thoughts on the organizers themselves?
Well, I think what you're doing is perfect. It's exactly what we do. We model initially as we're doing this. If students give us a complete sentence in the graphic organizer, we convert that into a shorter statement so that we can remember the idea. We emphasize that plans are not meant to be the end product. That is basically a general idea of what you're going to do that takes some shape before we start the writing, and then in which we'll revise later. So a couple of things that you might think about doing on this, which are slightly different. I really like what you're doing, but sometimes we have kids come back after they've developed their plan and written their composition, and we have them look to see where they've changed or added. They've dropped something or added something. Sometimes they drop something inadvertently. They didn't really mean to, and they pick that up. And so it helps kind of make this bond between your plan and making sure you do what you wanted to do. But it gives us a place to emphasize, that that's an initial plan and you want to go beyond that as well. The other thing that we've sometimes done, and we don't do this very often, but I have done it, we'll have kids who will write the full sentences. So we'll have them do that, and then we'll have them write their story, and we'll ask them, what they think about doing this. And almost always they say they didn't enjoy writing it out once and then writing it out a second time. And so that's a way that we have introduced the idea of doing notes before. But I really like what you're doing. I think that's great.
Great. Well, thanks for all of your input, and I think everyone here learned a lot about writing today and some good takeaways. So we're giving you a virtual round of applause. And thanks to everyone attending the webinar today. We'll be sending up a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording. Also, as you exit the webinar today, you'll get a survey that'll open, and we would appreciate your feedback to help us improve and plan future webinars. If you did not get to your questions today, we will follow up individually, and if you have any additional questions, you can email webinars@mheducation.com. Thanks, everyone, and I hope you have a great Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Bye.
Okay.